for another day of exciting plenaries and discussions. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping things to take note of. Right? Please ensure that your mobile phones are kept to silent throughout the session. Toilets are located at the east wing of level 1 next to the gallery. Refreshments will be available throughout the day, but kindly take note that eating is not allowed inside the session rooms. Okay, and then exhibition booths are located in the pre-function and gallery. Feel free to explore and network during the coffee breaks or lunch breaks. Also, don't miss out on the lucky draw that is going on. So in your goodie bags, you should have a lucky draw card that you can get stamped from each of the exhibitor booths. And then, alright, Sunway University practices a very strict no plastic policy. Please support this by avoiding the use of single-use plastic items. Water refill stations are available throughout the university. You're encouraged to bring and refill your own tumbler. Okay, and finally, we know there are many interesting sessions running concurrently in all of the tracks, and we do encourage everybody to attend whichever as you favor. However, as you are leaving the room while the session is ongoing, we do hope you are mindful about the door behind you and please close it quietly as you leave. Right. Thank you. Okay, and so I would also like to highlight the agenda for today very briefly. So we have a morning session and an afternoon session today of 3 plenaries, followed by a panel Q&A. We will then break for coffee before resuming with the rapid-fire presentations until lunchtime. So the same session will happen in the afternoon as well. We also have side events running in JC3 and LT5, and to find out what all of these sessions are, please scan the QR code on the back of your text for the most updated agenda. Alright, so now without further ado, okay, I would like to invite the chairperson of the session, today's session, which is Dr. Ashley Zulkifli. So just briefly, I'll just introduce. Dr. Ashley is a family medicine specialist, trained and qualified in Australia. Upon returning to Malaysia, she joined the National Cancer Society Malaysia as the clinical services lead. She oversees the Cancer Health Screening Clinic and the Nuclear Medicine Center, spearheading nationwide cancer screening and HPV vaccination initiatives. Her work is driven by a strong commitment to health equity and reaching underserved communities. Please welcome Dr. Ashley.
Okay, thank you everyone. Good morning. Happy to see familiar faces. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our very first esteemed speaker, which is Dr. Boon. She'll be presenting on breast cancer in Asian women, why, how you live and where you live matter. She is a statistician and epidemiologist in the Cancer Prevention and Population Science Research Unit at Cancer Research Malaysia. She earned her PhD in Public Health and Biostatistics from Monash University, Malaysia. Her current work focuses on breast cancer prevention and early detection, particularly among Asian population. She leads population-level risk prediction efforts and has recently developed and refined the ARICA risk calculator to help identify women who may benefit from genetic testing. Taking it a step further, her goal is to develop new or calibrate existing cancer risk models to inform individuals of their risk and guide effective affordable screening strategies in low-resource settings through the lens of decision remodeling. Building on this, she works closely with local and international experts to support data-driven approaches to cancer control with a focus on population-level insights. Dr. Ang, the floor is now yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm here to present some of the prevention works that we do at Cancer Research Malaysia. Again, I'm Boon, So today I'll be walking you through a series of published as well as ongoing studies that we do on breast cancer in Asian women. So to provide some insights into why how you live and where you live matter. So looking at worldwide breast cancer statistics, as you can see from this graph itself, so what we see is that breast cancer remains the most common cancer among women and is also the most common cause of cancer death in women. So as you can see from this statistics, globally 1 in 20 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer in their lifetime, and 1 in 7 will die from the disease. So as for the plot itself, by 2040, global breast cancer incidence is projected to increase by 40%, and the global breast cancer death is projected to increase by 50%. And at the current rate itself, every minute, 4 women are diagnosed with breast cancer, and 1 woman dies from the disease as I speak. So however, the breast cancer burden is not evenly distributed across different world regions. And taking Asia as an example, so Asia accounts for approximately 43% of global breast cancer cases and about 47% of global breast cancer death. And from here, when we were to compare European and Asian population, what we found is that by 2040, breast cancer incidence as well as breast cancer mortality are expected to remain relatively stable, like a plateauing rate as in European countries, but it seems to that they'll be rising rapidly in Asian countries. In Malaysia, 1 in 23 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer in their lifetime. But again, this is below the global average, which I presented in previous slide, 1 in 20. But again, we do see a higher rate for Chinese women and Indian women. So this emphasizes that there is a need of looking into ethnic variation within our population when we to study any epidemiological studies looking into associations or even any potential patterns in terms of breast cancer or any cancer. So this slide summarizes the challenges that we see when it comes to breast cancer control. So the first challenge that I would like to emphasize is thank you. Okay, yeah. So the first challenge that I would like to highlight is while we have access to case control data, we do not have, we have limited access to population level data, like a large prospective cohort data. The second challenge that we have is that while it is more common in Western studies that we have extensive studies being funded to actually build and validate models to predict risk for women, we do not have any locally validated risk prediction tool for breast cancer, for instance. And the third challenge is that we do not have any systematic nationwide screening in place for breast cancer. So far what we have is opportunistic with limited reach. So these challenges persist in many low and middle income countries, that includes Malaysia. So our efforts here is to close these gaps. So while these evidences are quite abundant in the West, but again, the question that we ask ourselves, are these true for Asians? Can we apply these findings from the Western directly to our population? So given that we do not have the population level data to look into this in detail, so we at Cancer Research Malaysia, what we do is we leverage on published data from literatures, and we also use established biomarkers to conduct research. So I'll just walk you through what are the studies that we have conducted. So I have 3 studies that I'll be walking you through throughout this talk. The first study is on, we have completed a systematic review and meta-analysis that provides us a list of breast cancer risk factors that are relevant to Asian women. And subsequently, what we have done is also to estimate the population attributable risk, which means it quantifies what is the impact of each risk factor on the overall cancer burden in a given population using a standardized formula. And then the third part is where, in the absence of population cohort data, what we use is that we use mammographic density as a surrogate biomarker, like a proxy, to actually explore potential associations. So these are the 3 studies that I'll be walking you through. So the very first one, I'll be walking you through the systematic review and meta-analysis. So for breast cancer risk factors, what we have done is we systematically reviewed 128 Asian studies, which was published between 2010 and 2023. These are on mainly examining breast cancer risk factors involving 6 million Asian women across different Asia regions, which includes Central, West, South, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. So of all the studies that we have reviewed in this review, we found that only a quarter of the studies are prospective cohort study. Prospective cohort studies means you follow a group of individuals, like a large cohort, for a certain period of time. They're starting from a point where they're very healthy, and then they develop cancer eventually. So, and the rest of the studies, which was 75% of the studies we have seen, is mostly case control. It's like you collect at one point of time, and you know there are a group of cases and controls. So that's the overview of the description of the studies that we have pulled from the literature. And from this, the question is why I'm segregating case control and prospective studies. While case control can be informative, but they cannot establish any potential causation. Like you cannot confirm, say, this causes this, right? If in the case of longitudinal study, i.e. the prospective, where you follow a cohort from a healthy state to a point where they develop a cancer, you can actually reduce the reporting bias, and you can also potentially establish a causation. Right? So technically what we found that is generally there's limited prospective studies in Asia, and there's none from Malaysia. So now that we have the study, what we do next is we quantitatively analyze the findings from the published literature. So how we do it, we call it as a meta-analysis in scientific term. So what we do is we pull published data together, and then we analyze what are the factors that is predicting in our Asian population. So what we did is the question that we ask ourselves, are we really different? Are we really different as an Asian? Are we really different from Europeans? So what we did here is a meta-analysis of prospective Asian studies. So we compared a couple of risk factors that are listed in this forest plot here. We explored family cancer history, we explored lifestyle factors, we also explored reproductive risk factors. So we compared our meta-analysis output with the published meta-analysis in Europeans. So when we compare them based on 2 parameters. The first parameter is reproductive risk factors. And the first factor is relative risk of breast cancer risk factors. And the second parameter is the prevalence of these risk factors in a given population. So the first plot on the left is on the relative risk. So what we found is that the relative risk of breast cancer risk factors are broadly comparable across the population, except for some factors like alcohol, smoking. These are of lower prevalence in our population, so it makes sense. So in terms of relative risk, we are similar. But we are different in terms of risk factor distribution in the population. So what I'm saying by this is that while the relative risks are comparable, the prevalence of the risk factors in our populations are different compared to those in Europeans. So how does this imply is that even though we have similar relative risks, when the distribution of these risk factors is different in a population, the population level of impact for these risk factors differs across the region, across different populations. It's very much dependent on what is the culture, what is the living, what is the lifestyle, what is the reproductive pattern that is adopted, depending on the targeted population. So that's on systematic review. Wait now, let me see. One more time. Yeah, I missed another one. So just want to highlight to you, among all the risk factors that we analyzed, all the risk factors had been reported to be of higher prevalence for Europeans, except for passive smoking, which is interesting. Passive smoking is more common in our Asian, especially among women. I think it's only 2%. While the rest of the Western people when you see active smoking is more common in the West, passive smoking is more prevalent in our setting, but the smokers is less than 2%, at least for women. For men, it's about 40 to 45%, of course. So now that we have the list of risk factors, the next thing that we want to do is we want to quantify the burden. What do I mean by that? We actually calculated the population attributable risk for each of the risk factors. What we did is to roughly to know how much does each of these risk factors impact the overall cancer burden using a formula. So So we apply the Levin's formula, and it just needs these two parameters. The first parameter is what is the impact of a risk factor on the breast cancer risk. That's the first one. The second input that we need is how many people are exposed to this risk factor in a targeted population. So again, the question is, why do we even need this parameter in the first place? PR help us to highlight, of all the factors that you have analyzed, which factors actually contribute the most to the overall burden, and therefore you can direct the preventions to where it should be prioritized so that it can have the greatest impact. So that's on this. So when you look at European data alone, the top three attributable breast cancer risk in a European setting are mammographic density, alcohol intake, and also oral contraceptive use. While mammographic density remains the most attributable for Asian women, that was not the case for the other two modifiable risk factors. So the top two modifiable risk factors that we found for Asian women is actually higher BMI, which is being obese or overweight, as well as passive smoking. So, and on top of that, we also found that applying a standard BMI cutoff to an Asian woman that we often use in a scaling system, it tends to overestimate an overweight risk and underestimate obese risk. Why is it so? So the way they have found is that we do carry more fat, and therefore we have a higher metabolic risk at the same level of BMI compared to Europeans. So it was suggested that for the Asian BMI cutoff, it should be lower than the standard BMI cutoff that we use. So for example, for overweight, it should start somewhere between 23 or 24 instead of 25. And then for obesity, it should start somewhere between 27 to 28 instead of 30. So that's on BMI. And the third point is on passive smoking. Well, again, as I mentioned, it's more common to see active smokers among Western, but not in Asian setting. So passive smoking seems to be like a significant factor, especially among women in Asian setting. So that's the second study on population attributable risk. And I'm moving on to the third study, which is the last one. Before that, I would like to introduce you what is the surrogate biomarker that we're talking about. So in the absence of a population level data, so what we do use is that we leverage on a mammographic density, mainly because mammographic density is a very strong breast cancer risk factor. It's not just in our country, but it's also in other Western countries. So we leverage mammographic density as a proxy, as a surrogate biomarker to assess breast cancer risk and its key determinants. Just to give a brief background on why we embarked on this study, is mainly to study the impact of urbanization on breast cancer risk. So urbanization is often linked to breast cancer, and we all know that increasing report has been reporting that this could be because of the changes in the lifestyle or reproductive pattern in a given population, right? And the question that we ask ourselves is, does where I live matter? Does living in an urban area pose a risk? And if so, why? So to explore this, we use mammographic density again as a proxy to explore the association between urbanization and breast cancer risk and what actually drives these changes. So in collaboration with Magna, we enrich our data set with women from rural area, and together with our urban cohort, so we managed to pull together and analyze approximately 10,000 healthy women. And from this study, what we found is that, so the idea is basically to explore what actually drives the changes between mammographic density comparing urban and rural population. So this is what we call as a mediation analysis in a statistical term. It's one of the ways for you to identify what actually drives the changes. So it has 3 different steps. So as summarized in this slide. So there are 3 different rules for each of the steps. The first rule is that the urbanization alone should be associated with mammographic density. That's the first rule. And we explored this using univariable regression analysis. Only if the first rule is satisfied, we move to the second rule. Second rule, it says that the urbanization must also be associated with lifestyle and reproductive factors that we know from our systematic review. So these are breast cancer risk factors. So it's listed below there. Some of the reproductive factors, lifestyle factors, and hormonal use has been analyzed in this study. So this is the second rule. The second rule also uses a univariable regression analysis. It's an analysis to look at association technically. The first rule it must be associated with mammographic density. The second rule is location also must be associated with the potential breast cancer risk factor. Only if these two rules are satisfied, we move on to the third rule. The third rule is the main agenda, where it gives you the final output that you want to know from basically what you want to know in terms of what drives the changes. The third rule is that these factors must also be associated with mammographic density in a multivariable analysis adjusted for urbanization in a sense. So this is an overview of the analysis with 3 rules and 3 different steps. To break it down to a layman, so I just break down to 3 different research questions. So the very first rule is actually to explore if does living in a city increase breast density? And what we found is that, well, indeed, women in the cities have more dense breast tissue, and this is consistent across all ethnicities. That includes Malay, Chinese, Indian, and other ethnic subgroups. And this is also consistent with the literature, as we found that both mammographic density as well as breast density were found to be, were often reported to be higher among urban dwellers. That is the first rule. So the second rule, so the question that we explored is, does living in a city influences life choices? That is, the way we live. So indeed, what we found is that the choices that we make on our daily life, that whether it's related to lifestyle or even a reproductive choices like family planning, these are all also influenced by our surroundings. So that's the second rule. Only if the first 2 rules are satisfied, we move to the third one. That's the end part of your mediation analysis to actually answer the research question on what actually drives these changes in mammographic density by location. So again, just to recap, is that the link between the urbanization and mammographic density is not direct. It's often because urbanization alone cannot explain what's actually happening. So the idea is that it's because of the other factors that is driven by the urbanization actually causing the change in breast density. So among all the factors that we have observed and analyzed in the analysis, we found that reproductive factors, particularly number of children and also breastfeeding, were found to be a significant mediators. So what does this mean? Again, so we found that there's a lower breast density observed among women living in rural area. So, and this is partly influenced by the number of children and also their breastfeeding habit. So, and this is consistent with what we see in the literature, is that when you have more children or you do have a breastfeed their children, it was often associated with lower breast density and reduced breast cancer risk. But again, just to take note is that the proportion that it explains the differences is only roughly between 10 to 17% of the differences that we see between urban and rural in terms of mammographic density. And also to pinpoint that one of the limitations in the study is that we did not manage to explore all the risk factors. We were limited by the data that is collected by the 2 different data collection centers. So what we have is so far, we found is this is the protective effect, which is observed among rural women. So this is pretty much consistent with what we see in the literature as well. So to summarize, as Asian, we are different. So these are here some key takeaways. The first is use BMI cutoff tailored for Asian women. The second is to focus on passive smoking, not active smoking for women. And while the third point may not be relevant to all women, again, this is not every woman can be able to apply this concept, but again, this is something to take note of. It's possible that childbirth and breastfeeding is also able to reduce breast cancer risk. So how you live matters, and where you live partly shapes it. And before I end my presentations, I would like to thank all our partners from Magna, SJMC and UMMC, and also our funding, Wellcome Trust, Yayasan Petronas, Estée Lauder, and Yayasan Samdarbi. And with that, and also my teammates at Cancer Research Foundation, who is also here. Thank you very much.